are taking the only measures we have to bring inflation down.
And putting 2 million people out of work is just part of the cost, and they just have to bear it.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
There's so much good TV coming out of the U.S. Senate right now.
Yeah, yes, there actually was. There really was a lot happening in D.C.
Let's take a look at this inflation stuff first, I guess.
Sure.
The Federal Reserve has nothing to say to the millions of people that it wants to make unemployed and no plans to avoid a recession. That's the takeaway from the Federal Reserve's chairman, Jerome Powell's testimony in front of Congress last week. And so let's play this interaction between him and Senator Elizabeth Warren where this becomes clear.
We are taking the only measures we have to bring inflation down.
And putting 2 million people out of work is just part of the cost, and they just have to bear it.
Well, will working people be better off if we just walk away from our jobs and inflation remains 5-6%?
Yeah, he says the only measures we have. He said, would the American people be better off if we just walked away from our job? Very much potentially. Yeah. Yeah, very much. Because if the only tool that you have is a hacksaw, then maybe you ought not be trying to, I don't know, lay concrete. If the only tool you have is a hammer, maybe you ought not try to perform brain surgery. Maybe you ought to hand the job to somebody else whose tool matches the job better. And that's the issue here with what the Federal Reserve is doing with their interest rates. Because it is true that raising interest rates is really one of the only measures that the Fed has to combat inflation, but they aren't the only, the Fed aren't the only people that can combat inflation. Nixon used price controls, let's remember.
And you may be bringing this up later, but I have to say that we have had Senator Bernie Sanders, among others, calling for windfall profit taxes. Right, so there are already things out there in history and in current conversation, current legislation. So to pretend as if we have two options,
right?
And they do this all the time. But this false dichotomy that we only have two options. Well, you can choose to have unsustainable inflation, or you can choose to tank the economy and lay a bunch of people out of work.
Yeah.
And you just pick your poison. Which, if I accept that is true, what does that say about your system? What does that say about your system if you are presenting that American capitalism has two options? The inflation is going to be so high you're going to struggle to pay for food, or we're going to have to lay off another 5-6% people of the workforce and lead us into a recession.
Yeah.
If that's truly the only options we have, then maybe the system itself is the problem.
Yeah. And, just to put this very crudely to help folks understand, and I'm not an economist, but we've had one on that echoes this. We talked to Hadassah here. But raising interest rates is a tool to tackle too much demand for not enough supply. It's a tool to decrease the amount of money in the system. But if that's not the issue, then decreasing the amount of money in the system is not going to help. What if instead of that, the issue is actually that we just went through a pandemic that massively shifted spending habits? What if supply lines have been massively disrupted? What if there was a European war driving up energy prices? What if 50% of the increased prices in consumer goods are going straight to profits, not towards the production of goods? Well, then raising the interest rates would not fix any of those problems, and that is the situation that we're in. And yet the Federal Reserve continues to raise rates. It's almost like there's an ulterior motive disciplining labor. And it's also the case that inflation is decreasing for the last 7 months straight, and with no bad side effects for workers yet, amid their onslaught of higher interest rates. For 7 months straight, the inflation rate has decreased, and the unemployment rate has continued to fall or stay steady. Jobs continue to be created. I mean, even if you think that the Fed has a role to play here, there is everything to be said for a cautious and judicious approach that is respectful of the precarious position of working people. And that's not the approach that the Fed is taking right now.
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all.
Will working people be better off if we just walk away from our jobs and inflation remains 5-6%?
Let me ask you about what happens if you do this. Since the end of World War II, there have been 12 times in which the unemployment rate has increased by 1 percentage point within 1 year, exactly what you're aiming to do right now. How many of those times did the U.S. economy avoid falling into a recession?
You know, it's not as black and white as very
Just
very
looking
infrequent.
at the numbers, it actually is pretty black
Alan
and white.
Blinder's written a book on this, and
There have been 12 times that we've seen a 1 point increase in the unemployment rate in a year. That's exactly what your Fed report has put out as the projection and the plan based on how you're going to keep raising these interest rates. How many times did the economy fail to fall into a recession after doing that? Out of 12 times.
I think the number is 0.
I think the number is 0. That's exactly right.
There have been 12 times that the unemployment rate has increased by 1 percentage point in a year. And every single time. So just think about this. Think the unemployment rate increasing by 1 percentage point. She says that's 2 million workers out of work. That is, I mean, right, that in and of itself is something that you're really going to have to justify to get me on board with it, right? You're really going to have to justify putting 2 million people out of work. That in and of itself is bad enough. And that is explicitly the goal of the Fed, is to bring the unemployment rate up by 1 percentage point in the next year. That's their goal. That's what they want to happen.
And it's interesting, too, because the logic is more or less, if we punish enough people, they will be buying less stuff, and therefore demand will go down, and the prices will go down as well. I don't think that's going to work. The historical record seems to indicate that's not going to work. So, what's it really about then?
Yeah. But even beyond the 2 million jobs, the historical record shows that every single time that his goal has been accomplished, there's a recession that follows that, which means millions of more people are out of work. Millions of more people have to take pay cuts. Millions of more people have to take other sacrifices at their workplace. Healthcare cuts, retirement cuts, all this sort of stuff. Beyond just 2 million people being out of work. I mean, just a total ghoulish behavior here. I don't understand it. Well, I mean, I do understand. They want to discipline labor. They think that working folks are getting too uppity. I mean, our wages are still rising more slowly than inflation. The idea that workers have too much money is an absurdity. It's just absurd.
Right, and I'm sorry, but they have yet to prove the case to me that it would be worth it, even if by some chance this were to work, which there's literally no reason to believe it will work. And by work, I mean, reduce the inflation the way they're proposing. Even if this were to work, I mean, how many millions of people have to suffer for that to be the case? I mean,
Yeah.
And obviously, as working people, we're against inflation. Like,
Right.
no, none of us want to see the prices go up, but that's not because our wages are going up and they're just having to keep up. No, that is 100%. Well, I don't want to say 100%. Obviously, there's a lot of factors here, but corporate price gouging is a huge part of this. The pandemic and the war, all these things, and then the inflation itself, right? That becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because now you can say, oh, it's that inflation. Yep,
Right.
that's why we jacked prices up 10%.
Right.
It's that darn inflation. Everybody else is going up, so we do too. And it just starts rolling and rolling that way. But I think companies, particularly in industries that are heavily monopolized, which are more than a few, we have, the meat industry, for example. Meat prices have gone through the roof.
Mm.
And the meat industry is heavily monopolized. It's just a handful of companies that control the whole damn thing. There's just, there are alternatives to punishing working people to fix inflation. It's just, it's an absurd false dichotomy that, Jerome Powell is putting out there. And as far as I can tell, the president of these United States, the Biden administration, has no qualms about it.
Yeah.
I haven't heard anything. And as you've made the point on the show before, that at least Trump in the past, like, if Jerome Powell is doing something he didn't like, he would call him out for it.
Yeah.
So I can only assume that Biden has no problem with it. Or he's just, as Democrats often do, they're respecting the office and civility.
Respecting the independence of the Federal Reserve.
Civility politics. And yeah, well, on the
Institutions.
on the West Wing, they sure wouldn't say something. So, we're going to let him do his thing. But it's, and that's why I mentioned it earlier when we were talking about Alabama's budgets. Okay, great. The budgets are looking good this year. But when the head of the Federal Reserve is telling you in plain English, we are going to drive up unemployment. And if you check our record, we are going to create a recession. That's kind of a big deal.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.